Good morning and welcome to this Zoomcast. I'm John Wyatt, editor with Walls and Ceilings magazine. And today, joining me is our industry friend, Buck Buchanan. Buck, I saw you last month and it's always great to catch up with you. But this time is a little different. You weren't with Parex, you're flying solo now. You've retired and, well, I use retired in quotation marks, but why don't you tell us where you're at today?
Yeah, John, thanks a lot. I look forward to being with you and chatting about a couple items. I retired from Parex in 2017, and I'd spent over 35 years in the EIFS industry. And since that time, I've started doing some consulting work. I've written 3 books. I'm very involved in our community. I'm in the Rotary Club here. I'm involved in our church. And I got 5 grandkids that live within 15 miles of us that I get to go and see a lot of activities. So there's plenty going on. And in the meantime, my wife likes to travel. So we travel as much as we can. And I play a little golf in between all that. So I stay fairly busy these days.
So when you guys travel, do you have a camper? So you kind of go along the mountains? Where does it take you?
Well, my wife's idea of camping would be the Holiday Inn. So the answer to that is no. So we will drive. Sometimes we'll fly. We enjoy going to Europe. We've done several river cruises. We're actually going to Portugal in August and do a river cruise there down the Douro River. So we like that as well. We've done ocean line cruises, and as a matter of fact, we're going to Virginia Saturday to investigate the vineyards in Virginia.
Oh, that sounds like a good time.
Yeah.
Cheese and wine, right?
That's it.
So when you fly into Portugal, you're probably going to land in Lisbon and then go north, correct?
Yeah, we land in Lisbon, and we go to Porto, and from there we catch the boat, and it takes you down the Douro River and into Spain. You turn around and come back. So it's almost a 2-week trip. So we'll do some sightseeing on the front end and the back end before we come back to Atlanta.
You're going to enjoy that part of the world, and I hope you guys like seafood.
Well, we do like seafood, and we are planning on enjoying it for sure.
Excellent. Well, before then, we got some things to discuss, my man. And I guess the big headline is congratulations on Behind the Walls. And this came out, I think, was it early this year, late last year?
It actually, I rolled it out at the annual EMA meeting, which was March the 23rd. So it's only been out a couple months now.
Well, I saw you pushing books in Texas, and unfortunately, you had some snags there with the electronics, didn't you? So cash is still king.
Yeah, it's okay. We worked it out though. So
I'm glad to hear that. And listen, I've been immersed in this since you sent it to me promptly. I should add to anyone that has an interest in ordering this book, but it is great. I'm beyond the halfway point. So but what I felt I'd like us to do is maybe do a part 1 and a part 2. And so this first part, as you and I have kind of discussed, I'd like to get in the genesis of this book. So listen, tell us how you came to write this. What was the germ of the idea?
Well, as I said, I'd written a couple other books. And so I've figured out how to write a book somewhat. And since I was in the East business for so many years, it just seemed like it had to be a story to be told. And I think a lot of people talk about the EIFS industry, but they generally talk more of the technical aspects of it, the science behind it, and some of those type things. And I want this book to be about the people. And it's the people that developed the industry to the ones that furthered it on and continue to carry it on forward into today. Because it's really an interesting story in my mind, and there's some real interesting people involved in it. So I want to tell their story. And it's really about how the industry evolved in the United States, how it started, how it grew, how it consolidated, how it matured. And that's kind of the way the book flows as well, to try to walk everybody through that. And along the way, talk about stories of some of the people. So that's kind of where it started and how it got to where it is today.
You are 100% correct that this is very much a book about people and not technology, product, systems. You, in fact, make a point to just get that out of the way, probably in the first 5 pages, explain what EIFS is, but it's really not bogged down in a lot of technical jargon. So how long did this take you to write?
Well, the idea came to me. I'd been thinking about it for a while, but the official start was July 2020, and that's when it started. And then again, I released it earlier this year, so it was a 2-year project, and of course that was in the heart of COVID. So I found it to be, a good something to keep me busy during COVID, as well as some other people too. But the book actually started with my first interview, and that first interview was with Frank Marstelli.
You mean today, not back in the day, but you're referring to today, because Frank still is alive, correct?
Yes, when I started on the book in July of 2020, he was the first person I talked to. And so I started making notes and preparing the book from that point on.
We're going to get to Frank in just a second here to introduce him, but it's I don't know how you went about writing this. Did you have like a blackboard behind you and a grid, like a family tree? I mean, there's a lot of time shifting in this book. You start with history, and then as these companies develop, grow, are founded, you introduce people along the way, and then you'll shift back to another company, and then back in time, and then so that must have been a lot to kind of absorb. So did you write this chronologically, or did you divide it by company and then address their history as you knew it? Tell me how you did this.
Well, it was certainly a daunting task, because when you try to put 50 years of history into a book, you run the risk of ending up with the next version of War and Peace. So I wanted to get it to a manageable size. So it's a little over 400 pages. And the way I did it, John, was, I interviewed many people. I interviewed or communicated with over 100 people about this project. And we would talk about things they would do. So I would take the notes by everybody, and I would take their notes of what they would say. And then from that point, I would formulate it into some kind of structure. And kind of when I get to that point, or at the midway point, I started beginning to able to say, okay, how would I put this all together? And that chronologically seemed to be the logical place, number one. Number two, by company. And then number three, by individual. And so trying to put all that together was really the approach that I took. And again, the book turned out to be really the chronological events. And there are some jumping back and forth, because you talk to someone that was pertinent in 1980, and although their career may have gone to 2015, their impact was really in the 1980s. So anyway, it was an attempt to put it all together again. So predominantly it's chronological.
Very much so, and it's a fun read. You introduce a lot of characters. So let's start with some of those characters. At the start of the book, you use a great narrative tool to where you introduce 4 people who seemingly don't know each other at that moment in time, but somehow their stories come together and interweave. Who are these 4 people? Can you, without giving away too many spoilers, talk about that?
The logic for that is I started talking to people. You found that there was a common thread for the people that were involved in the early days, and I'm talking about in the United States, were the affiliations they had with people that were involved in World War II. And as a matter of fact, when you look back at the EIFS industry, the technology of the EIFS industry, as well as many other industries, really evolved from World War II. So it seemed like a good place to kind of get started. And the four characters that I bring out in that book, two of them are Germans and two of them are Americans. And it talks about a brief summary of what happened to them during the war, and then years later, how they got involved in the EIFS business one way or the other. And some became affiliated with each other. And who would have thought that one individual who was an American pilot would end up working and being involved with someone that was in the German Air Force. So it's tried to tie those together, because I just thought it was an interesting point to start from. But again, because of the technology that evolved in World War II led to EIFS, as well as many other products that become predominant throughout our lives today.
So introduce who the pilot is to the readers.
So there's the four characters are Fritz Stoltmeister, who was a German. He was a young boy, as a matter of fact, that was into the German army, got drafted into the German army when he was like 16 years old and became a POW. He would later go on to be the one that started Stowe in Germany and eventually became Stowe in the US, as well as in 90 other countries.
Should we add right now that I believe he is the one that recently passed? Is that who I'm referring to?
3 or 4 weeks ago. So,
okay.
But he was the guy that really got the EIFS business going for Stowe. And most people believe he was really the father of EIFS from Germany. So that's another book, another debate, and so forth.
Right.
So he was one. Then the other German was Edward Horbach. He was the one that was the founder of Drive It. He was a Luftwaffe pilot and was involved in the bombing of London. And then when the Germans ran out of planes, he was shipped back, reassigned to the infantry in Greece, and ended the war in Greece. And then there are two Americans. They both happen to be involved in B-17s. Robin Knight was a radio man on the B-17 and flew numerous missions over Europe. And on their last mission, they were doing a bombing run, and they're going into a field of anti-aircraft fire, and the flak going all around them. They hit the tail. One of the engines was knocked out, and they made it back to their base. And about 4 days later, the war ended. So they survived all their missions. And the last one is Fred Fink. And Fred Fink was a guy that was a B-17 pilot. He was Jewish. And he had a ritual before he would take off to put his dog tags in his pocket in fear that he would be captured in Germany and maybe sent not to just a POW camp, but to a concentration camp. Anyway, on their mission, one of their last missions, they were shot down. But before they had shot down, the tail gunner on the aircraft had borrowed Fred Fink's jacket. Well, when the plane was shot down, they had to disable the plane. They had to bail out. Everybody survived except the tail gunner. And the tail gunner was recovered by the Red Cross. They went through his possessions. They found the dog tag in his pocket and notified Fred Fink's parents and family that he was killed in action. 3 months later, he gets out of the POW camp at the end of the world and goes home, and he's able to tell them that he's alive. So that's a pretty interesting story. And then getting into the EIFS business on top of that is another part of the story.
That certainly is. How does Frank become a part of this mix?
Well, Frank was,
and I'm sorry, we should say this is Frank Morselli for people.
Frank Morselli, yeah. Frank Marcelli is a really interesting fellow as well. He is still alive at 90 something years old. And he was the son of Italian immigrants. So with all the immigration that we talk about today, here's really an interesting story. His parents both came over from Italy, met here, got married, and went on. The father was a plasterer by trade. And Frank grew up as a boy working with his dad in plastering, but Frank wanted more out of life. And he became a musician, became a really accomplished drummer as a kid, and actually worked his way through college somewhat playing drums. He was, when he got his degree, he worked his way through school to earn his degree. He came out, he joined the Navy, he was in the Korean War, and was shipped off to Korea and saw duty over there during the war, and came back and from that and became in the reserves. But then he wanted to go to work, and he thought, well, I've got a degree at the University of Rhode Island. I want to get me a job with one of these big companies. I've been an ensign and lieutenant in the Navy. I should be able to do that. So he applied to a lot of big company jobs, and those big company jobs didn't offer him any jobs. So he finally decided, I better get me one. So he got a job as a brick salesman. He became a brick salesman, and he was so successful that he ended up buying the company he worked for, and then he bought another. He ended up having about 3 different brick companies scattered around, and was making a decent living. By then he'd gotten married, had a family, had 3 kids. And Frank would, from that point, was always looking to do something different. He'd done well with brick, but he described it, he says, I want to do something where I don't have to sell 1 million bricks to make some money. So he's always looking for a new technology related to brick, how he could do it. So he was meeting with the BASF people that were involved with their EPS business. And BASF had invited Frank over and says, come, let us show you what's involved with EPS and how you might be able to integrate that into your brick sales. So he did that. He took some people over there with him. And he took a good friend who was an engineer with him, not even working for him, by the name of Doug Creed. Doug Creed was just an engineer, and went with him to this meeting. BASF told him about a variety of things with EPS and construction. And one of the things that resonated with Frank was this new technique that came out of Germany, where they were putting insulation on the outside of buildings. And he was somewhat fascinated with it. And they talked more about that. And as they talked more about it, they found that there was a guy in the United States, happened to be in New Jersey, not far from where BASF was, that had just recently acquired the rights for a company by the name of Drive It. So the next day, Frank went to see this guy, and lo and behold, he was able to negotiate a deal to get the complete rights to Drive It in the United States for an interesting sum of money, which is in the book. He had to buy the book to know how much it was. And Frank reached agreement with this guy to purchase it on the contingency, give him 60 days. And during those 60 days, Frank wanted to go to Europe and see for himself what this Drive It stuff was all about. So he did. He went to Europe, and he spent 3 weeks with Edward Horbach. Edward Horbach, the Luftwaffe pilot, was the guy he spent time with. And he and Frank really bonded because both of them had been military guys. Both of them were entrepreneurs. So they really created a unique bond between the two. Frank was on his way back to the airport. He called his secretary and told his secretary, go ahead and send the check to the guy in New Jersey. I've seen the future, and I know what the future looks like. And from that point on, he started with Drive It in the late fall of 1969.
Just after the landing on the moon, right?
The what?
The landing on the moon, was that July 69?
Up until then, the big news of the day, there were 3 things. One was the landing of the moon. The other was Chappaquiddick with Ted Kennedy, and the other were the Manson murders. And then then you had the other event of the music up in New York. So
Woodstock. Okay.
Woodstock made the news too. So there was a lot going on in 1969. So you can understand how development of Drive in the United States flew under the radar screen.
So you had said Frank and Edward, right? Or Edvard or Horbach?
Edward Horbach, yeah.
Yeah. Was there a language barrier there?
No, Frank was actually impressively could speak German.
Really?
No,
Through his time in the war, or
no, he had a knack for languages. He could speak Italian, obviously coming from an Italian family, and he was able to speak a number of languages. And he was able to speak German, and Horbach was actually able to speak English as well. So they were able to communicate quite well.
And they were friends until Horbach's death, correct? Or
Correct.
that is a good story. And
Yeah.
You briefly introduced Doug, but from what I understand, Doug is still alive. Doug Creed, that is.
Yes, that's correct.
And could you briefly talk about basically his growth within the company? I mean, he was right there at the beginning with
Yeah,
driving.
he was right there at the beginning, and Doug was an engineer. He was executive director for the Structural Clay Brick Association, and he was a unique guy in the sense that he was a technical guy, but he also had a marketing mind, so to speak. And Frank had always liked Doug, and when they went to the meeting with this potential owner in New Jersey, he wanted Doug to go with him to get his opinion. Frank valued Doug's opinion a lot, and Frank and Doug were probably 15 years difference in age, Frank being older.
Okay.
But took Doug with him, and then on the way back to the airport, he offered Doug a job and to be the guy to head up the drive-it business. And it took several months for that to come to fruition, but eventually Doug did go to work and basically became his right-hand man. And then from that point on, Doug was really the guy that kind of kept things going behind the scenes. He was the guy that became well known within the industry. And he was also one that was able to help paint the picture of where EIFS could be and where EIFS could go, as well as Frank. So both of them were a very good 1-2 punch when it came to sales promotion that needed to be done in the early days of selling EIFS.
Now jumping forward a little bit in time, because for everyone that wants the full story, you got to get Buck's book, which I highly recommend. But I think an important part of this book, at least in the first half, is Black Friday. Can you talk to us what Black Friday was?
Yeah. So what led up to Black Friday was, first of all, Drive It had really done quite well. By the time the 1973 had evolved, they were done over 1 million square feet of EIFS. And that was really the first time that you got to think that EIFS went from zero in the United States to where it was. So in 1973, they were doing over 1 million feet. And then by 1976, they had actually done a 42-story condominium project in Florida. And by 1977, they had actually even got code recognition based on research reports. So they had really moved the ball down the field quite a bit. Well, as the business unfolded and as the business grew, they had to deal with manufacturing. So they set up manufacturing plants, had to expand manufacture, change locations and such. And as all this happened, Frank saw the need to bring on other people. So besides Doug, he brought on 3 other guys over the course of the next 5 years. One was Paul Paddock. Paul Paddock was the guy in charge of the manufacturing aspect of the business. He brought on Joe Vuno, who became the CFO because for the accounting purposes, and Frank Gicarelli, a guy that Frank Marcelli had actually been his best man in his wedding, came in to help with the sales and marketing. So those guys were put in place to help move the business forward. But what had the real catch to all this is in the early 70s, Frank's daughter was killed. His oldest daughter, Sandy, was killed in an automobile accident by a drunk driver. Just devastated Frank. Frank was just, it was taken back. It hurt him so bad he didn't know how to respond. And he really kept away from the business for a while.
What do you mean by a while? A month?
Well, no, several months. Several
Okay.
months. And then once he decided to get back involved in the business, he did it on, basically, he just wanted to go see customers. He didn't want to be around the office. Something about the thought of being in the Rhode Island office and that his daughter had been killed, he had issues with that. He couldn't be around. So what that meant is that these other four guys, Doug Creed, Joe Vuno, Frank Gincarelli, and Paul Paddock, were basically running the day-to-day business. Well, after some time, these guys, Frank's never around. He comes in every now and then and sees what's happening, but it's no schedule, all he's really is doing is going to see customers, which has a lot of value because Frank was excellent with customers, but he didn't want to deal with the day-to-day aspects. So these guys run the business. Well, they started having talks about, we're doing all the work. Frank's making all the money. We want a piece of the action. So they confronted Frank with this in the mid 70s, say 76, somewhere in that neighborhood, and said, hey, we want a piece of the action. Well, Frank resisted initially, but eventually did. And he gave them 1% of the business. Frank thinking that would calm things down and the team would get back together. Nothing really changed. As a matter of fact, he even named Joe Vuno the president of Drive It, and Frank became the chairman of the board. So, but as things progressed, again, Frank being away from the business, only dealing with customers, it became something these guys said, we need more control. We want a bigger stake of the business and so forth. So a series of discussions took place. And there was this one day in late night or in the spring of 1979 where there was a meeting planned, and the four guys again had another confrontation with Frank, and this time they brought a lawyer with them. And the lawyer made certain demands, and as a result, the four guys were no longer with the business. That was on a Friday, and that's where it came Black Friday. The four guys thought that would cripple Drive It, and it did set things back from a period of time. But what it did do is got Frank completely re-engaged in the business, and basically they didn't skip a beat. So the four guys left. Well, one of the four guys did come back. Frank Gincarelli eventually came back after pleading with Frank about that for some time. The other three guys went on and formed another company. That company became known as Synergy. So it was the first real disruptor, if you will, in the EIFS industry. And from that point, that launched the 80s into from the growth continue the growth program into the 80s as Synergy and other companies entered the market.
So by, let's say, in the late 80s, 1990, how many EIFS manufacturers were around?
At the peak, which was somewhere around that time, there was around 40 companies that were actually manufacturing EIFS products in the United States.
So would you call the late 70s, early 80s basically the big boom of all these companies being founded, starting up?
Yeah, I mean, Drive It pretty much had all to himself in the 70s. There were a few started entering the market in the late 70s, but really the 80s were when you saw an accumulation of companies start getting into it up until the mid 90s. So, but yeah, it went from, it was Drive It and nobody else to Drive It and the others. So when you come into the early 80s, it's Drive It and the others.
Another milestone in the book we should add is basically the formation of EMA. Can you tell us how that came to be?
Yeah, the genesis of it is, again, number one, you've got these new companies coming into play. So you had other companies. I mean, Synergy was evolving. Stowe had come into the marketplace. A company called Arwall was around. Insel Crete was another, and others were coming in to begin to make a name for themselves. But it was still Dryvit and everybody else. But the problem it was entering into is there were no official standards for the EIFS industry. There were no testing requirements. There were no standards for fire testing, impact resistance, weatherization, and so forth. And so the way that was working is you would go to the building code people, and you'd have to run a series of tests and get an engineer to provide with what they call a research report. So everybody had a research report, but then the interpretation, it was comparing apples and oranges. There was no way to compare the performance of Dryvit per se to one of the other companies as far as product performance. So what happened was a lot of people were stretching the truth, and they were expanding things. And so it became well, who do you really believe? This company said their stuff's no good, and these guys said their stuff's the best. So you really got into he said, she said kind of thing. And the architects and the building code people were beginning to say, look, you guys can't get your act together and get some consistency, so we've got something to evaluate. We're not going to use this product anymore. And therefore, these people were beginning to see it. The owners of these companies were seeing, hey, we better get our act together or we won't have a business. So really, EMA was formed as a result of several companies coming together, and with the first initial goal was to develop industry standards. And in the spring of 1981, 8 companies were formed under what is now called EMA. In those days, it was the Exterior Insulation Manufacturers Association. All the main members in the EIFS industry at that time were members, with the exception of Dryvit. And Frank Marcelli was clear. He was involved in several of these early meetings with the group before they were able to put the association together. And Frank, his opinion was, look, you guys prove to me that you can work together, and then we'll join the group later. And he held his promise. He did, and then joined 3 or 4 years later.
Sounds like you truly embraced it once he got in as well.
He did. He really did. He embraced them and became a huge supporter of them. But and you can't blame him. He had #1 position in the market, and he wanted to see, hey, are these guys going to shoot themselves to death before they get out the door, or are they going to work together to figure it out? And they worked together to figure it out.
So Buck, as we kind of joked during our talks about this, and this is nothing unique to the EIFS industry, but so many players have, started at this company and then they moved to another EIFS company. So, do you think EMA helped kind of bring some people together, just get over that competitive streak, and just had people that normally wouldn't be working together bond to some degree?
There's no doubt about it. It was, before EMA came around, it was, you'd look across the room at the trade shows, and if you had a hand grenade, you'd throw one over to the other guy's booth. And EMA was able to bring that group together. And once everybody said, this guy's really not a bad guy. And,
right.
And once everybody saw that, and then they really understood that everybody really was working for the benefit of the industry, because everybody was benefiting from it. So once those things were figured out, there was a lot of and that's frankly the way EMA kept it going, is that people really found that to be the place where it unified the industry, and it was not just about me versus them.
And let's move on to you as we wrap things up for this first part of our interview. So how you started in this industry is really interesting, and it's kind of like a friend of a friend. Actually, was it your brother-in-law or someone that your wife's sister was dating? I forget the full. Is a relation like that somehow?
Yeah, it was. Everybody's got a path of how they got in the EIFS industry, and they're all different. I had an interesting one because I was working for Greyhound, the bus company. So I had done really quite well. When I got out of school, I had a degree, but I was kind of like Frank Marcelli. I couldn't find a job. So I ended up working for Greyhound because they paid more money than anybody else. So I moved from Tennessee to Georgia and went to work for Greyhound. In 3 years, I had 4 promotions, or in 4 years, I had 3 promotions. And I was doing well, but I realized that Greyhound was not a place where I was going to make a lot of money. So I started looking for opportunities. And my sister-in-law was dating a guy at the time, and he had gotten involved in this new company, and he was telling me how great it was. And anyway, one thing led to another, and said they were looking for a sales guy in Atlanta. And so they fundamentally hired me. And I do have a caveat. I worked at a hardware store that sold building material supplies when I was in college. So at least I knew what a 10 penny nail was. But anyway, from there, I went to work for Stowe, and Stowe was just really getting started. I think I was the 13th guy hired on the payroll. I was one of the first hired outside of Vermont. Anyway, from there, I had an interesting first year with the company.
You hit the ground running, didn't you?
Well, I hit the ground. I was running, but I was running in circles and hitting trees a lot. So there was a big learning curve. It took me about 5 months to figure out how this thing really worked and how to get an order. So that was a big challenge. But how you get an order and how that worked, I finally figured that out. And then within my first year at Stowe, I went from a sales manager, or from a sales rep, to be the national sales manager in 12 months. So, and I tell people that's just because they didn't have anybody else around. I was the only guy left standing. But and there is a lot of interesting things. Is from my perspective, the guy that introduced me into the business was the sales manager at the time. He went on a few months later to marry my sister-in-law, so he did become a brother-in-law. And then I was in Germany in the fall of 1981, and was called up to Fritz Stockmeister's office and told there were going to be changes in the U.S. and that my brother-in-law was going to basically be let go, and I was going to get his job when I got back. And 3 weeks after I got back, we had Thanksgiving dinner at their house. So it was an interesting turn of events. And oh, by the way, I was given 6 months probationary period that I had to do the job or find another job. So I stayed with Stowe for 15 years. So I guess it worked out okay.
It certainly did. And one last thing, you actually, it sounds like, became friends with a couple of the Germans. So I think did Fritz have a son that you reported to, or that you worked with?
He did. Jochen Stockmeister, he and I are about the same age. He came over, probably a year after I joined the company, and was sent over here to basically kind of evaluate what was going on. And then he eventually became the president of the company, and then he went on to replace his father, and he became the driving force behind Stowe worldwide. And he used to tell me his dream was to have Stowe buckets in every country in the world. Last count I heard, they were up to 90 countries doing work. So he's not all the way there, but he made a pretty good inroad into it. And frankly, Stowe, Fritz had the vision to do it, and Jochen had the drive to keep things going. And there's some other parallels from other companies that they didn't have a Jochen Stockmeister to lead them through the startup phases, and they didn't make it. But Stowe was able to have Jochen here guiding them through, and Jochen learned a lot. He had some tough learning lessons along the way, but learned a lot and went on. And, Stowe today is certainly well known within this industry in the U.S. and certainly globally as well.
And from the sounds of it, he had a few speeding tickets up in Vermont.
Yeah, he liked to drive fast, but when you're driving on those autobahns in Germany, you get used to doing that.
I was on the Autobahn once, and it's all a matter of skill. And, everyone's going more or less the same speed, but you don't realize you're going 120 miles an hour.
Right.
So it's not like driving in a city where things are just flying by you. So um, the Autobahn isn't as intense as you think, but I certainly wouldn't want to break down there. But
Yeah.
um, so guys, we're going to conclude part one of this interview. I want to thank Buck Buchanan. Hey, Buck, quick, tell us how can people get this book? Tell them how they can contact you.
Yeah, it's I have a website. It's called booksbybuck.com. So it's easy to remember, booksbybuck.com. Or you can go to Amazon. It's everything's on Amazon. You can do it that way. But I'll give you, if you go to my website, I'll sign one and send it to you.
He signed mine, so I can attest to that.
Yeah.
Well, Buck, I want to thank you for your time, and in the spirit of our German friends, that's it for today, and Auf Wiedersehen. Buck, hopefully we can reconnect as soon as I finish up this book, which I'll put my foot to the pedal. All right.
There you go. Hope you enjoy the second half of it.
I already am. Thank you for your time, and everyone, thanks for tuning in, and stay tuned for next time. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Enjoyed it, guys. Take care.